Nobody expected anything extraordinary from Marcus that bitter December morning, least of all the rush-hour commuters who stepped around him like he was just another piece of urban debris. But when a shivering 6-year-old appeared at the bus stop with a broken zipper and desperate eyes, something happened that would shake everyone's assumptions about worth, dignity, and the true meaning of wealth. Chris hadn't expected anything from that morning either. It was December, and the sun was trying to break through the gray sky, but even it seemed to shiver from the cold. The air stood sharp and dry, one of those days when fingers go numb even inside gloves. Chris had no gloves, no mittens, no warm food, just a jacket. Old, worn, with a burned hole near the sleeve and lining he'd once mended himself with shoe thread. But it held warmth. And on the street, that was everything. Warmth. He sat at the bus stop on 47th and Broadway, like every morning. People passed by. Some turned away. Some simply didn't notice. He'd learned to be invisible. Until the boy appeared. Small. About 6 years old. His jacket was thin, the zipper broken. He stood with hunched shoulders, sniffling and staring at the road as if waiting for someone. People passed by. No one stopped. Only Chris watched. He slowly stood up and approached. The boy recoiled as if frightened. "Hey, it's okay," Chris said quietly. "Are you cold?" The boy nodded. He wasn't crying, just shivering. Chris looked at his jacket, the last thing he had left, then back at the child, and took it off. "Here, take this. It's old, but it's warm." He wrapped the boy in it, zipped it up as best he could, rolled up the sleeves. "Who are you waiting for, little man?" "Daddy? He went to get the car," the boy whispered. Chris nodded. He stayed beside him, didn't ask for names, just stood with him. Until a black SUV turned the corner, gleaming and tall like a skyscraper on wheels. A man in an expensive coat jumped out. The boy ran to him. Only then did the father notice the homeless man in a t-shirt standing nearby, and saw his son wearing a stranger's jacket, and understood. The next day, Chris sat in the basement of the shelter on Main Street. He didn't tell anyone why he'd returned here. He just wanted a roof and warm tea if he was lucky. In the evening, the door swung open. A man entered, not a worker, not a volunteer. He wore an expensive cashmere scarf, leather gloves, but his eyes were different, not arrogant, not frightened, just attentive. He walked straight to Chris. "You're the one," he said, "the one who gave my son your jacket." Chris stood up, embarrassed. He was freezing. "I couldn't just walk by." The man said nothing. He simply pulled out a set of keys from his pocket and an envelope. "There's an address here, a small house, 14 of Vancouver Street. It was empty. Was. Not anymore." Chris blinked. "Excuse me, I want the person who gave his last possession to my son to never be cold again, never have to ask, and never disappear into the crowd." He placed the keys in Chris's hand. Quietly, without fanfare, simply. "You don't know what my son was like before that day," he said. "Withdrawn. Didn't trust people. Now he talks about nothing but the man who did good. Just because." He left, without unnecessary words. And Chris stood there in the basement, with keys, and for the first time in a long while, with a feeling that didn't burn but warmed. Hope. A week later, Chris opened the door. The house was warm. In the kitchen was a note. "There's food in the refrigerator, a new jacket in the closet. But if you want to keep the old one, keep it. It already saved a life." Chris smiled for the first time in many years, and understood. Sometimes, to change someone's fate, you just need to share warmth, even when you have almost none left. The routine had been predictable for months. Every morning at 7:30, Chris would position himself at the same bus stop, watching the same faces hurry past with the same studied indifference. The suits, the students, the mothers with strollers, all of them had mastered the art of looking through him rather than at him. He'd become part of the urban landscape, as ignored as a fire hydrant or a stop sign. But that December morning, when the temperature dropped below freezing and his breath came out in visible puffs, something shifted in the carefully choreographed dance of avoidance. The first sign that this day would be different came when Mrs. Henderson from the coffee shop across the street emerged with a steaming cup and actually made eye contact. She'd seen him there for months, had probably watched him shiver through countless mornings, But this time, she hesitated at her door. The hesitation lasted only a moment before she retreated back inside, but Chris had caught it, a crack in the wall of invisibility. Then came the boy. He appeared around the corner like a small ghost, his thin jacket doing nothing against the biting wind. No parent in sight, no guardian hovering protectively nearby. Just a child, alone, with shoulders drawn up to his ears and tears starting to freeze on his cheeks. The morning commuters flowed around him like water around a stone, their attention focused on phones, on schedules, on anything but the shivering figure in their path. Chris felt something stir in his chest, not just sympathy, but recognition. He saw himself in that hunched posture, in the way the boy tried to make himself smaller, less noticeable. The universal posture of those who've learned that the world has no room for their needs. Rising from his usual spot on the bench, Chris approached slowly, hands visible, movements careful. The boy's eyes widened, not with trust, but with the wariness of someone who'd already learned that adults could be dangerous. "Hey there," Chris said, his voice softer than the winter air. "You waiting for someone?" A nod, barely perceptible. "Where are they?" "Daddy went to move the car, said to wait here." The words came out between chattering teeth. Chris looked at his jacket, the one thing standing between him and the full bite of winter. He'd found it in a donation bin behind a church 3 years ago, had sewn up the holes himself with thread scavenged from an old shirt. It wasn't much, but it was everything. Without ceremony, he shrugged it off and wrapped it around the boy's shoulders. The cold hit him immediately, sharp and unforgiving, but the relief in the child's eyes was worth the shock. "Better?" Chris asked, adjusting the oversized jacket. Another nod, this one accompanied by the ghost of a smile. They stood together in comfortable silence, two figures against the morning rush. Chris felt the cold seeping through his thin shirt, felt his fingers beginning to numb, but he also felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Purpose. For the first time since he'd lost his apartment, his job, his dignity, he was exactly where he needed to be. The black SUV that rounded the corner 15 minutes later looked like it cost more than Chris had earned in his last year of employment. The man who jumped out wore a coat that probably cost more than Chris had spent on food in the past month. But when their eyes met across the sidewalk, Chris saw something unexpected in the stranger's gaze. Not disgust or pity, but recognition. The father's eyes moved from Chris to his son, taking in the oversized jacket, the careful way the homeless man had positioned himself to shield the boy from the wind. Understanding dawned slowly, followed by something that looked almost like shame. "Thank you," the man said, his voice barely audible over the traffic. Chris just nodded. Words seemed inadequate for the moment. As the SUV pulled away, Chris felt the full impact of his decision. The jacket was gone, and with it, his primary defense against the elements. But something else had taken its place, a warmth that came from within, a reminder that even in his reduced circumstances, he still had something to give. The walk back to the shelter was brutal. The wind cut through his shirt like a blade, and by the time he reached the building on Main Street, his lips were blue and his hands were shaking uncontrollably. The volunteer at the desk took one look at him and wrapped him in a blanket, pressing a cup of hot coffee into his trembling hands. "What happened to your jacket?" she asked. "Gave it away," Chris replied simply. She didn't ask for details, but he caught her exchanging glances with another volunteer. In their world, giving away your only protection from the elements wasn't noble. It was dangerous. That evening, as Chris settled into his cot in the crowded dormitory, he tried not to think about the morning's events. He'd done what felt right in the moment, but the practical consequences were becoming clear. Without the jacket, his chances of surviving on the streets had diminished considerably. He might have saved a child from discomfort, but he'd potentially signed his own death warrant. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the sounds of coughing, snoring, and the occasional nightmare from neighboring cots. But when Chris finally drifted off, his dreams were warmer than they'd been in months. The next morning brought a surprise that would change everything. Chris was in the shelter's common room, nursing his second cup of coffee and trying to work up the courage to face another day without his jacket, when the front door opened and a familiar figure walked in. The man from the SUV looked out of place among the shabby furniture and fluorescent lighting, but he moved with purpose, scanning the room until his eyes found Chris. "I've been looking for you," he said, approaching with a measured stride. Chris set down his coffee cup, suddenly conscious of his appearance, his circumstances, the gulf between their worlds. I wanted to thank you properly, the man continued. What you did yesterday. He paused, searching for words. My son hasn't stopped talking about it, about you. It wasn't anything special, Chris said, though he found himself sitting up straighter. It was everything, the man replied. Do you know what my son said when I asked him about the man who gave him the jacket? He said, Daddy, he looked cold, but he made me warm anyway. 6 years old, and he understood something that most adults miss entirely. The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. My name is David Morrison. I own a construction company here in the city. I've been thinking about what happened yesterday, about what it means, about what I should do about it. He handed Chris the envelope. Inside were keys and an address written on expensive letterhead. I own some properties around the city. Investment properties, mostly. There's a small house on Vancouver Street that's been sitting empty for months. I was going to sell it, but he gestured at the keys. I think it has a better purpose now. Chris stared at the keys, unable to process what he was hearing. I don't understand. You gave my son your jacket, the only thing standing between you and freezing to death. You did it without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. That kind of character. David shook his head. That's rarer than you might think, especially in my world. I can't accept this, Chris said, though his fingers had closed around the keys instinctively. You can and you will, David replied firmly. Because my son asked me to help the man who helped him, and because I've seen what real generosity looks like, and I want to learn from it. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with David explaining the practical details and Chris struggling to believe that his life had just taken such a dramatic turn. The house was small but fully furnished, the utilities were already connected, and there were even groceries in the refrigerator. Why? Chris finally asked. Why all this for a stranger? David was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. Because yesterday morning, my son learned something about kindness that I've been trying to teach him for years. He learned it from a man who had nothing but still found something to give. That lesson is worth more than any house. As David prepared to leave, he turned back one more time. There's just one condition, he said with a slight smile. I'd like you to meet my son properly sometime. He's been asking about you, wondering if you're warm enough now. 3 days later, Chris stood in front of the small blue house on Vancouver Street, key in hand, still unable to quite believe it was real. The neighborhood was quiet, tree-lined, the kind of place he'd driven through years ago when he still had a car and a different life. The key turned easily in the lock, and the door swung open to reveal a living room that looked like it had been staged for a magazine. Comfortable furniture, warm lighting, even books on the shelves. But it was the note on the kitchen counter that brought tears to his eyes. Welcome home. The jacket you gave Tommy is hanging in the front closet. He insisted I return it to you, though he says you should keep it as a reminder that kindness comes back to you. The refrigerator is stocked. There are clothes in the bedroom closet, and all the utilities are set up. But most importantly, you have a home now, a place where you belong. Tommy talks about you every day, about the man who taught him that sharing is caring. He wants to be like you when he grows up. I hope you'll let us visit sometime soon. David and Tommy Morrison. P.S. There's a job waiting for you at Morrison Construction whenever you're ready. Tommy says any company would be lucky to have someone so kind working for them. Chris sank into the kitchen chair, overwhelmed by the completeness of the gesture. This wasn't just charity. It was recognition, acceptance, an acknowledgement of his worth as a human being. For years he'd felt invisible, disposable, less than human. Now, because of a single act of kindness, he'd been seen, valued, and given a chance to rebuild his life. The jacket was indeed in the front closet, cleaned and mended, hanging next to a brand new winter coat. Chris pulled out his old jacket and held it up to the light, examining the patches and repairs he'd made over the years. It looked shabby next to the new coat, but it represented something invaluable. The proof that, even when he had nothing, he'd still found something to give. That evening, Chris called the number David had left. When Tommy came to the phone, his excitement was infectious. "Are you warm now?" were the first words out of the 6-year-old's mouth. "Very warm," Chris replied, and meant it in more ways than one. "Daddy says you're a hero," Tommy continued. "He says heroes are people who help others even when it's hard." "I think your daddy might be right," Chris said, looking around his new living room. "But you know what? Sometimes being a hero just means sharing what you have, even when you don't have much. Can we visit you sometime?" Daddy says you have a house now. I'd like that very much, Chris replied, and for the first time in years, he was already looking forward to tomorrow. The transformation wasn't immediate. Chris still struggled with the adjustment, still sometimes felt like an imposter in his new life. But David's job offer provided structure and purpose, and Tommy's enthusiasm reminded him daily that his actions had mattered, had made a difference. 6 months later, Chris stood at the same bus stop where everything had changed, but now he was the one in the expensive coat, the one with somewhere warm to go. He'd kept his old jacket, though, and when he saw another figure hunched against the cold, he knew exactly what to do. Because sometimes changing someone's life is as simple as sharing your warmth, even when, especially when, you think you have nothing left to give.